Army investigation has found that military intelligence officers issued questionable orders to enlisted reservists who were guarding the Iraqi prison. According to the report, quote, military intelligence interrogators and other U.S. government agency interrogators actively requested that MP, that's military police guards, set physical and mental conditions for favorable interrogation of witnesses. Major General Antonio Taguba, who headed the investigation, wrote that abuse by military police included videotaping and photographing naked male and female detainees, forcibly arranging detainees in various sexually explicit positions for photographing, and forcing groups of male detainees to masturbate themselves while being photographed and videotaped. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is at the Pentagon. Jim, I've got to ask you, just on the ground, it seems to me if the Arabs in the street over there, especially in Iraq, see this kind of stuff on television, they ain't ever going to surrender because they're facing this if they get picked up.
Well, Pentagon and U.S. military officials here at the Pentagon are simply livid over this episode. One Pentagon official saying that these pictures and this entire episode has set back U.S. policy in the Middle East by at least 20 years. But there's something even more serious than that in the short term. They believe that the opponents of coalition forces and American troops on the ground will be further emboldened, could actually gather up some new allies in their fight against the U.S. And therefore, those troops on the ground in the short term could be put at more risk.
Let me ask you about that. Getting to the very point here, if you're out on patrol today, tomorrow, the next day, does it make it less likely that an Iraqi insurgent will surrender?
No. I mean, the likelihood that an Iraqi insurgent would surrender at this point, not because he's afraid of being mistreated once in the custody of American soldiers, but because, as I said, they're further emboldened. And if the U.S. was there to try to win the hearts and minds, as they appear now to be doing in Fallujah, one day the Marines are going in, one day they're not. That whole situation is equally confusing. And there's some here at the Pentagon who are beginning to question whether there's been a total breakdown in the command structure of the U.S. military there in Iraq, not only at Abu Ghraib, but in several of the other instances we talked about.
I'm trying to recall how intelligence works and interrogation works. A friend of mine years ago was in intelligence. He said, you're not allowed to make the prisoners say anything, but you're allowed to let them say anything. It's a very subtle thing when you try to get a person to tell you what he doesn't want to tell you. What is the sense over there in terms of the rules?
Well, you know, there are techniques that the U.S. military does use that they claim are within the rules, such as not necessarily sleep deprivation, but sleep interruption, constantly keeping the prisoners off base, rocked back on their heels, depriving them of some food rations occasionally, putting them in solitude, but nothing that approaches anywhere near what we saw in those pictures.
Well, what about the notion of humiliation as a technique? This clearly falls into that category.
Absolutely. And U.S. military and Pentagon officials say that that is absolutely not allowed, particularly when you're dealing with the Arab culture, which, according to Mideast and Arabist experts, say that it is a particularly sensitive issue when men are seen naked by other men, particularly women, or certainly engaged in simulating those homosexual kinds of acts that we did see in some of those photos.
Seems pretty logical to me that we're causing more enemies than we're making friends over there. Anyway, thank you, Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon. Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona was an advisor on Iraq's armed forces during the first Gulf War. He later worked for the CIA and participated in a variety of sensitive operations in the Mideast. He's now an MSNBC political analyst. We're lucky to have you today, especially as an officer, as a former officer with the U.S. military. Your personal reaction, first of all, Colonel, to this?
Appalled. I mean, it is morally reprehensible and inconceivable to me that a member of the U.S. military would act this way.
Well, are these pervs that just found their way into the military? Are they stupid people? Are they desperate sexual, what do you call it, deviants? Or were they beyond, what is it, what do you call it, frustrated sexually? Why would they get involved in these kind of explicit, staging of explicit sexual acts, homosexual acts, whatever? Why would they do that for fun? It looks like they were all laughing in these pictures.
Well, yeah, this looks like it started out probably as some sort of prank. Let's see what we can get away with. and it just carried it to its logical extreme. Obviously, these pictures were taken to send home or to show something. You could see the way they were laughing and all that. My problem with all of this is, where is the supervision? Where are their senior NCOs? Where are the officers?
Do you have a sense, maybe, I don't want you to prejudge particular cases, but the defense of these men is that they were operating under orders, that this was signals sent officially or not by the military intelligence, soften these people up, humiliate them, wear them down, scare them, threaten their lives so that they're broken by the time we come in with the tough questioning.
Yeah, now, I've heard that, and that's very likely that the military intelligence, who was responsible for the interrogation and the extraction of information, would ask the prison guards to soften them up, so to speak. But there's a line you don't cross, and you know, these young military policemen know what that line is. It doesn't take a whole lot of training to know what's right or wrong. They cross the line. This goes beyond any acceptable behavior.
So your sense, well, let me try to figure it to trail this down. Is it a question of I was only obeying orders, which you seem to have knocked down as a defense here? What was it? Just insubordination? Just a bunch of, you know, what do you call them? Hot doggers.
Young troops out of control. They obviously were not well supervised. The NCOs and officers running that prison did not instill the right discipline in that. I know they may have thought they were helping the military intelligence people, but they went way beyond anything that's the norm. I don't think you can say I was following orders. I don't think that's going to wash.
Didn't they? I mean, anybody that would be who's involved in a schoolyard fight in their teens knows you don't make enemies you can't deal with later. Why would these guys want to make any Arab guys in the country they're in personally mad at them? Or is that too normal to ask a simple question like, don't these guys know that they're going to hate our country when they get out, and they will get out eventually? They're going to join whatever force they can to get even for this humiliation. There's going to be a natural blood hatred, isn't there, towards Americans?
Sure, but I don't think that was entering their minds. I don't think they thought this all the way through. Their view of the war is very limited. They were working in this prison. Their job was to manage these prisoners, to follow the instructions of the military interrogators that were going to be working with it. They're not thinking long term. They're not doing the political analysis, but they have really set back our relations in Iraq.
Do you know the word brutalize, how it's actually supposed to be used, which means not that you're brutal to people, but you become brutal because of stresses and because of the way you're treated. Were these guys possibly victim to just the whole experience of being in those, working in those prison settings?
I'm sure that there's a lot of stress dealing with these people. Remember, these are not the compliant prisoners of war that we were dealing with in Desert Storm. These are combatants. These are people that are being held against their will. These are true believers in the cause. I'm sure there are discipline problems in that prison, but that's why you've got seasoned senior NCOs and you've got professional officers that are supposed to manage what's going on in that prison. There's a breakdown in command in that prison.
What's the mood in the military right now about this? People who are still in uniform, what are they saying that you hear about this?
Everybody I've talked to is just morally outraged. They cannot believe that this is happening. They cannot believe that in the days of the all-volunteer military, the professional military that we have, and you know the fine troops we're sending over there, that all of their reputations are now besmirched by the actions of 7 to 10 people. They're outraged, Chris.
I thought there was supposed to be a wall between the people who are interrogating the military intelligence folks and the people in charge of incarcerating these people. And that wall, the people in charge of incarcerating are not supposed to be part of the intelligence, you know, the rubber hose or the hard stuff. They're supposed to be a separate wall there. This is where a case where the wall broke down?
Sure, that's probably what happened here. The military intelligence, of course, they're more interested in extracting information. The military police are responsible for the security and the discipline in the prison. But the overall responsibility for what happens inside those walls is the senior military police officer. And the military intelligence people have to take a back seat to that.
Well, let's talk about that.
That wall seems to have crumbled.
Yeah, they're blaming everything on MI. Anyway, thank you very much, Rick Francona. When we return, still ahead, the wife of one of the soldiers accused of abusing Iraqi prisoners will be here to defend her husband. You're watching Hardball on MSNBC.
He was shot and killed in Afghanistan while going back to rescue soldiers caught in an ambush. Stephen White served with him in Iraq.
He directly saved their lives with that move. Pat sacrificed himself so his brothers could live.
A foundation has been set up in Pat Tillman's name. As Senator McCain put it, many will live longer lives, but few will live better lives. In San Jose, California, I'm Carla Wohl, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Thank you, Carla. The American contractor who escaped his Iraqi captors will reunite with his wife tomorrow. Thomas Hamill arrived at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany today, where doctors say he is doing well. He escaped from an unguarded farmhouse north of Baghdad yesterday and flagged down a passing convoy with members of the New York Army National Guard. Hamill was kidnapped last month when his convoy was ambushed. Officials say he may be ready to go home this week. And when we come back, does your body language make you look like a security risk? We look at a controversial new way to fight terrorism at the airport.
And there's some strong gusty winds.
Gross pictures we're looking at now.
Showing now, he was not in any of those pictures, and that's what I want the American public to see and other nations to see. They're judging my husband on these pictures that have other U.S. soldiers or other people from that company.
Well, let's read. Mrs. Frederick, let's read one of the letters he sent to you. This is from the New Yorker magazine this week. It quotes a letter from your husband he wrote to you in January. That's 4 or 5 months ago. It reads, I questioned some of the things that I saw, such things as leaving inmates in their cell with no clothes or in female underpants, handcuffing them to the door of their cell. And the answer I got was, this is how military intelligence wants it done. Military intelligence has also instructed us to place a prisoner in an isolated cell with little or no clothes, no toilet or running water, no ventilation or window for as much as 3 days. The military intelligence officers have encouraged and told us, Quaid, great job. They were now getting positive results and information. You know, I've worked in big corporations and stuff, and I sympathize with people at the bottom because they do get the signals over and over again. This is good work here, nice work, and then if you're doing something wrong, you should be told. But normally, it's what you're supposed to be doing. Let me ask you about your sense of the military intelligence. Was it your understanding that your husband's duty and the duty of his fellow men was to get these prisoners ready for interrogation?
That's what I learned out later on. But, you know, when you're looking at people like military intelligence, my husband doesn't know what the rules of military intelligence is. He's never been trained on the rules of interrogation. He's never been trained on dealing with POWs or detainees in that type of environment. The environment totally different.
But why do you need training not to have guys stacked up naked or simulating or involved in these sort of homosexual acts? Why would somebody need to be trained to not do that?
Well, I haven't seen my husband been accused of
I'm talking about what we're watching in these pictures, this whole disgusting picture we're seeing here.
Well,
why should people be trained not to do this? Yeah, but why should somebody be trained not to do that? Shouldn't they just know they shouldn't do it?
When you think about the military, this is my second marriage. My first marriage was to a Marine, and I know how military desensitizes people to be able to go out there and defend their country, and in defending their country, they may have to shoot a person point blank and not feel response and be able to continue on. This is part of the process of becoming a soldier. And, you know, I feel like they put my husband in an uncompromising position. He was told they're getting the job done, good job. And my husband constantly asked for some type of guidance, which was never done. So your basic,
as you understand the case that will be made by the attorney for your husband, the case is that he wasn't trained. His whole unit wasn't trained properly. They weren't given strict guidelines on how to treat prisoners. If anything, they were given encouragement to get these guys, quote, ready for interrogation. Exactly. They were put in a bad position without any rules, not even the Geneva Convention. I mean, he didn't know what was lawful or unlawful there. And, you know, my question now is, why or how did this stuff go on with these agencies or these civilians, and the military didn't know about it? Mrs. Frederick, thank you very much. Hold on for a second. You've been very clear on this. Let me go to Colonel Rick Francona. Rick, Colonel, let me ask you this question. Listening to this wonderful lady talk here about a difficult situation she's facing in her family, is that the case, that enlisted guys working under the supervision, ultimately, of the military intelligence units are basically forced to do what those guys want done to get those prisoners ready for interrogation?
Well, I'm sure that that's the position he felt he was in. But, you know, there's a line you don't cross. And these military policemen are trained in the handling of prisoners. And I don't know about the specific unit, but that's part of the function of the military police. I mean, they do a variety of functions. This is one of them. The military
But these are reservists, though, Rick, aren't they? What about the fact that they're reservists?
Well, the reservists are trained. Yeah, they are, but they have supervision. I mean, someone is in charge over there, and someone did not exercise discipline in that prison. There are senior NCOs, and a staff sergeant is pretty senior. He needs to know. He should know what he's doing.
Let me ask you, Mrs. Frederick, one last time. Did your husband go to his higher-ups within the military police?
I don't know who he went with through the higher-ups. I never did hear, but I'm pretty sure that my husband never got trained with dealing with POWs. All his duties beforehand, when he was called to active duty before this, they were doing road patrols.
But he knew how to treat prisoners in custody because he worked in the corrections system in Virginia. So he knew the regular way we treat regular American criminal prisoners.
You cannot base correctional center training on when you're dealing in a foreign country, foreign language, foreigners. He doesn't know what the military intelligence rules were. He was never given any rules, period.
Yeah. Hey, thank you very much for coming on. Martha Frederick for coming on Hardball. And thank you, Colonel Rick Francona. We're going to talk to excerpts from the Army report on the alleged abuses. Go to Hardball if you want those excerpts. I've been reading them myself. Hardball.msnbc.com. Up next, the latest from President Bush's campaign bus tour through Michigan and Ohio, two big battleground states. You're watching Hardball on MSNBC.
Pure Jewish state has been unwavering, not even by one vote, or one letter, or one resolution has it wavered. And as president, I can guarantee you that that support and that effort for our ally, a vibrant democracy, will continue. I have but I want to share with you more personally why that is so. Because you often hear those words, but it's important to understand sort of how they connect to somebody, what it means. And I want to do that particularly in the context of ADL. And because my first trip ever to Israel was under the guidance of not just ADL, but Lenny Zakem. And we spent one entire week traveling through the country, visiting. Dick Levsky was with me.
In Iraq. Most of these people are seen as stooges by most Iraqis. Hopefully, Brahimi will be able to begin a process where Iraqis can choose their own government. For 13 months, no important decisions in Iraq have been made by Iraqis, and that's far too long, I think.
Is it your judgment that the so-called insurgency, the obvious terrorism on the part of some, will end with a handover if the United Nations can put together a rational interim government and then prepare for elections in January of 2005?
Unfortunately, I don't think the terrorism will end. I think the insurgency will. I think it's directed at the U.S. occupation. And if it's clear that the United States is leaving, will not try and keep bases there, which the Iraqis definitely do not want, and will not try and keep control over Iraq, I actually do believe that the insurgency will die down.
Let me ask you this, Professor. As you look at what's happening in Iraq, why has there not been a greater sense of responsibility on the part of the Arab states of the region to be supportive, to be engaged in providing for a stable Iraq? The United Nations, until August, when their offices were attacked, were engaged in Iraq. They withdrew. Do you fear, for example, that the United Nations, once again, coming in under new auspices, would once again, if you will, cut and run?
Well, I don't know what the United Nations will do. I think terrorism directed at the UN might lead to that. Hopefully not. One reason that regional countries and other countries have not been involved is they were not asked by the United States. In fact, they were dismissed in a very callous way by the Bush administration. They were told they weren't needed. The United States would do as it pleased and would bring along whoever wanted to come along on American terms. That is why...
That's a broad statement, Professor. You really know what the United States did with 22 Arab states?
Well, not just Arab states. Countries like Turkey.
Well,
countries like Iran.
The 22 Arab states in the region.
A number of Arab states supported the American intervention. Most did not. Largely, I think, because they felt the United States was not consulting them. Largely because I think they felt the United States was doing these things without paying attention to facts we now know to be true. No weapons, no link between this regime and terrorism, no particular danger by Iraq to even its closest neighbors. So most countries in the region simply didn't believe the American rationale.
and the import of the way in which the United States turns over sovereignty to the region itself, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, let's hope sovereignty will eventually be turned over. What's going to happen on June 30th is not the handover of sovereignty. General Sanchez will control everything in Iraq, and the American ambassador will probably make most decisions. But when it happens, hopefully soon, I hope that will have a positive impact on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Well, Sheikh Khalidi, we thank you very much for being with us. Come back soon, and you've given us a glimmer of hope here.
Well, I hope so.
Hello, I'm Christy Musumeci. Half past the hour. Here are the headlines. Escaped hostage Thomas Hamill is said to be doing very good at a U.S. military hospital in Germany, and his wife headed there to meet him. Officials say Hamill escaped yesterday from a shack near the town of Balad, north of Baghdad, and ran to a passing U.S. military convoy. He was held captive for 3 weeks. Authorities in Turkey say they foiled a plot to set off a bomb at next month's NATO summit in Istanbul, which President Bush is scheduled to attend. Police say they seized guns, equipment to build remote-controlled bombs, plus books and CD-ROMs on bomb making. 9 suspected members of an al-Qaeda-linked group have now been charged. Scott Peterson's attorneys are requesting a second change of venue, saying the current jury selection proves it's impossible to seat an impartial jury in San Mateo County. The case was moved there from Modesto. A hearing on that request now set for May 11th. Those are the latest headlines. Back to Hardball with Chris Matthews.
Welcome back to Hardball. Campaigning in Michigan today, President Bush defended his decision to take America to war in Iraq.
Well, I was faced with a choice. Do I trust the word of a madman who had used weapons of mass destruction, who had professed his hatred for America, who had ties to terrorist organizations, who had funded suiciders into Israel? Or do I defend America? Given that choice, I will defend America every time.
Former Vermont governor and Democratic candidate for president Howard Dean is a John Kerry supporter right now. Welcome, Governor Dean. Thanks for joining. What's your reaction to hearing the president say that on the stump?
Oh, it's just more nonsense of the kind he's been talking about for the past year and a half. Defending the United States of America had nothing to do with getting rid of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's a dreadful person, but he was never a danger to the United States. The president has admitted there was no connection between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. So what the president does, and the Republicans are so good at doing, is they make an assumption that's not true and then they defend it. The president didn't have a choice between defending the United States of America and taking the word of a madman. We know Saddam Hussein's word was no good. We also now know, after Richard Clarke's testimony in his book, after Paul O'Neill's testimony in his book, that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with the threat in the United States, and the president was going to go to war with Saddam Hussein long before 9/11.
Well, let's try to put what you're just saying in the context of your campaign. Many months back, you were a sharp critic of the war. The statistics, the polling shows that many more people, not a majority yet, but many Americans have come to question the purpose of this war. What was your reaction when you first heard, having campaigned against the war unsuccessfully in a political sense, but I think your message got out to many people? What was your reaction when you heard they couldn't find any WMDs over there? Did you think there were going to be WMDs in Iraq?
I actually did think there would be some WMDs in Iraq. The concern that I had about what the president was saying was it was clear that they were not about to get nuclear weapons. What the vice president said was not true. It was very clear to me that Saddam Hussein was not tolerating al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was no al-Qaeda in Iraq until long after we got rid of Saddam Hussein. So I was not so concerned about the WMD because I knew Saddam had those for a long time. We'd been able to control Iraq easily with no-fly zones. I was concerned about the false information the president was giving the American people, and I still to this day don't know the real reason we went to war in Iraq.
Weren't you surprised when the president came out several months back and said there was no connection between the Iraqi government and 9/11?
Well, he had been for a long time intimating that in fact, there was a connection. But you know, the president doesn't lie outright. What he does is let people think things that aren't so. For example, talking about the connection between defending the United States and attacking Saddam Hussein. The truth is there is no connection, and there never has been. And if you pressed him on it and had the opportunity to ask him that question in different ways, he'd have to admit it. Just as he admitted there was never any Iraqi purchase of uranium from Niger, just as he ultimately admitted there was no connection between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. But you know, 80% of people who watch Fox television think that there is a connection. Even 24% of people who watch, who listen to NPR think there is a connection, because this administration has been trying to hint that there was a connection for these many months. Over 700 American brave soldiers have dead, over 3,000 wounded. I think this president has a lot of explaining to do in this election.
What about the happy Iraqi scenario that Howard Fineman likes to call it, which is the argument by Ahmed Chalabi, and bought apparently by many within the Defense Department and the Vice President's office, including the Vice President, that from the moment we got over there, we would be cheered. I went back and looked at all the quotes from Vice President Cheney before the war. They're going to love us to death over there. Well, certainly they're not loving us to death this week. Were you surprised at or not, by the anger and the hostility toward the occupation?
Well, I'm not surprised. I think that the administration was likely not misled by Ahmed Chalabi. I think they simply used the information he gave to browbeat the CIA into giving them information that the CIA operatives knew was probably not completely accurate. Chalabi was an excuse more than he was, I think, an instigator. And I think smart minds would have discounted what Chalabi said. Chalabi is wanted for bank fraud in Jordan and had been convicted of bank fraud in Jordan.
Right, embezzlement, yeah.
And so people who are convicted of embezzlement are not generally the best sources in the world. I suspect our government knew that, and they disregarded it because of the president's obsession, really, with Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Why?
I think my argument is...
You're a doctor, but you're not a psychiatrist. I don't believe you're board certified. But how do you know George Bush was obsessed with going to Iraq?
There has to be some reason that he started talking about it, as Paul O'Neill wrote in his book, long before 9/11 in cabinet meetings. There has to be some reason that he kept pushing for this war without any evidence or reason to do it. I still don't know what that reason is today. Look, I believe in the strong defense of America. If it were up to me and I had been president of the United States, I would have continued to surround Saddam Hussein as we did, with no-fly zones. I would have continued to try to get the United Nations to put enormous pressure on him, and then I would have devoted some of the $87 billion we've spent so far in Iraq on Afghanistan, where we're still under pressure from the Taliban. That is a real danger to the United States, and that's where we ought to be focusing our defense.
Let me ask you about what the president... You believe the president purposely lied to the American people at this point?
There's no way of knowing whether he was simply given terrible information.
So he's not impeachable. You don't believe there's grounds for impeachment, do you?
Well, even if there were, certainly the right-wing Congress was not about. I can tell you if Bill Clinton had done this, I suspect he would have been impeached.
If you were in Congress now, would you vote for an impeachment resolution?
Not without knowing a whole lot more than I do.
But your indictment is so strong, it sounds like articles of impeachment.
Well, I don't believe the president. That doesn't mean I can prove that he's impeachable. I think that would be a step that you should not call for unless you know what the facts are. We simply do not know what the facts are.
But you believe he was so obsessed with going to Iraq, he was willing to sell the argument that they had WMDs, willing to sell the argument that they were connected to 9/11, in fact, suggest that to the American people, intimated, as you said, and third, willing to sell the argument it's going to be basically a cakewalk, not an occupation.
Not only that, his administration also told the American people that we'd be able to pay for this with oil money.
Right,
and of course, taxpayers are out $87 billion as a result of this administration not being truthful with Congress.
Do you believe we can democratize Iraq? Right now, looking forward to the next 5-10 years.
Actually, as someone who did not support the war going in, I think now we need to try to do the best we can. I do not believe that this president will be successful in democratizing Iraq because he has no ability to work with the countries that we need to bring in. I think there is a possibility that we can end up leaving a democratic Iraq, but it's going to take 8 or 10 years, as I said during the campaign, and we can't possibly do it alone. Since this president managed to insult virtually every ally who we need to help us democratize Iraq, the right thing to do is what John Kerry wants to do. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a John Kerry supporter, which I am, but bring in the UN, bring home the majority of American troops, particularly the Guard and Reserve, who have no business being in a place like this for this length of time, and turn this into international reconstruction, not an American occupation. We've got to get the targets off the backs of our men and women in Iraq.
Do you think this latest scandal, it is a scandal, and it may be totally separate, I hope it was, from the whole system of running that war over there, and I think it is, this mistreatment of prisoners, this sort of graphic, disgusting use of prisoners for sexual sport or whatever the hell is going on over there. What do you think it says to the world, or what should it say to the world? Just do we have a couple of freaks in the Army, or what?
Well, war is very difficult. I don't excuse that conduct for a moment, but I don't believe the vast majority of American troops are anything like that. I believe that most people in the armed services are as horrified as you or I are by that kind of behavior. We know that
but you know from history, that if you're involved in counterinsurgency, whether you're the French or you're us, that you have to get information out of the so-called insurgents. You can call them resistors; it's just as fine with me. But you have to, if you're involved in being shot at every day, and IEDs, these explosive devices being used against us, and all this treachery against us every day, don't you have to get rough with the prisoners to get the intel to protect the lives of your troops?
I think that depends on the circumstances. Certainly, if a bomb is about to go off and kill 300 men, women, and children, that's a different standard than evidently having these people under lock and key and humiliating them deliberately. I always think humiliation is a very dangerous weapon to use. The president promised us a foreign policy based on humility, but instead gave us one on humiliation, humiliating both our allies, including President Fox, Gerhard Schroeder, Chirac. And those are all people we need in one capacity or another. So, you know, I don't excuse this in any way, but I don't think it's typical of the conduct of American forces in general. There have been outliers in every war. We all remember the horrible doings of Lieutenant Calley at the My Lai massacre, which was far worse than this. There will always be people who ought not to be in the jobs they're in, but I think the vast majority of American troops are nothing like that.
Okay, I agree with you on that. Thank you very much. Stick with us, Howard Dean. I want to talk about the Kerry campaign and what you think might improve it. Coming up, John Kerry's launching a multi-million-dollar ad blitz this week. He's going on television to tell his biographical story about who he is. And there is a picture of him fighting in Vietnam. You're watching Hardball on MSNBC.
Follow all the action in the battle for the White House. Sign up for our
professionally and honorably. What matters when the U.S. is trying to win over Iraqis is how this looks to Iraqis.
And it looks terrible. Remember last year, the U.S. opened so many prisons. Inmates told of the terrible torture under Saddam, and the U.S. was saying, all that is over now. Now, what Iraqi will believe anything the U.S. says after hearing detainees like Hashim Muhsi Lazem, a policeman who says he was in that pile of bodies.
While they were punching, my head was thrown forward and the cover of my head lifted. I saw a woman in the room with the camera in her hand. The interrogator saw me. He put his hands on me like this, with his legs on my stomach. He choked me until I felt I was going to die.
The damage to the U.S. in Iraq from all this? ABC consultant Tony Cordesman puts it starkly.
Because of this, hundreds of Americans are either going to die or be wounded because it breeds far more hatred, far more resentment, and far more violence than any of the information gathered could possibly be worth.
An American journalist who wrote a book called New Jack about his year working as a correctional officer at a New York prison says it is always the higher-ups who set the tone.
It's fair to say that every prison has two sets of rules. One is the official set that you're taught during training or when you first arrive at a place. And then there's the day-to-day practice, which is very much a matter of knowing how much the people above you will back you up if you do something a little bit marginal, if you use too much force, if you hurt somebody by mistake.
Two of the soldiers in this case served as correctional officers in prisons in civilian life. They're now claiming that officers from military intelligence encouraged this rough treatment of Iraqi detainees to soften them up for interrogation.
The truth of the matter is that in every war, on the part of all troops, prisoners are interrogated violently against the rules of war. The history of Vietnam had those cases. Certainly in the case of Korea, what happens when you have an inadequate command, inadequate training, people rushed into positions for which they have no background and no natural aptitude.
these are extreme exceptions to the norm.
I think they are extreme exceptions, but we need to remember that war is filled with extreme exceptions, just as it is filled with incredible acts of generosity.
This is how we like to picture our troops, and sometimes, often, it is the truth. But so apparently is this, at least in this extreme case, and the question to ask is how could they cross this line, not as soldiers, but as humans?
There's a reason for discipline. There's a reason for training in human rights.
Because it's so easy to hurt somebody who your country hates, or who people like you tend to dislike. If it's the enemy and here they're under your control, you can see there must be a temptation to abuse them.
What you can almost be certain of from other types of hazing is that there's sort of a contest, an effort to show off, to become the person who does the thing that is most outrageous.
That may help us understand why this happened, but no one is arguing to excuse it. It seems, however, the U.S. military never intended for this to come out. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff specifically asked CBS News to delay its broadcast last week. Now it is out. Tonight in the Middle East, interviews with released detainees were airing over and over. For audiences to whom it's irrelevant why a few American soldiers would do bad things, for viewers inclined to think the worst of the U.S., it's enough to know that they did. I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Washington.
When we come back, the general in command of the prisons responds to these latest charges.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by America.
Supposed to like them anyway because he cut $1.8 billion out of the Veterans Administration. But they're so angry, they know that Kerry served with distinction. He has a Silver Star. You can say whatever you want about how much shrapnel he got in his leg, but people don't get Silver Stars without being genuine war heroes. Yeah. Every veteran who served abroad, who ever got a Purple Heart, is thinking about George Bush, who never served a day in his life overseas, Dick Cheney, who dodged the draft with 5 deferments, and thinking, how can these guys say this about one of their brothers? I think the attack on Kerry's military service was a fatal mistake for the Republicans, and I think when we do the exit polling in November, we're going to find a significant switch.
You've toted up Cheney's deferments to 5. I only have 1: college, grad school, and then marriage. What else? What are the other 2 you got? How many deferments could a man have?
That's what it said in the New York Times, and I know it's true. You cannot believe everything in the New York Times.
Okay.
That's true.
Let me ask you, during the course of those last weeks of the campaign, you remember with such poignancy.
There were 2 college deferments, by the way.
And convey to me, don't you feel, didn't you ever at the campaign, when he pulled out Rasmussen, the guy who he pulled out of the water over in the river with the guys, the VC shooting at him, did you for a slight second there say, if only I'd gone to Vietnam, I could be beating this guy right now?
You know, I wasn't thinking like that when I was 25 years old.
No, but I mean, when you're in the I meant, Governor, when you're in the campaign against Kerry and he's beating you over the head with his war record, didn't you wish you had one?
No, you know.
Come on.
I don't think that way. I really don't. I think Kerry.
Well, I would.
Really good
I would say this guy's got something I don't have, and he's beat me with it. I wish I had that.
No, well, I don't. I mean, I don't. What happens in campaigns happens in campaigns. Look, if California had been before Iowa, I'd be where John is right now. That's just the way it is. So, you know, I've seen 1,000 hockey games because both my kids, my daughter and my son, both played hockey since they were 5 years old.
Yeah.
I call that stuff woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Right.
When the referee makes a call you don't like, well, that's part of the game.
Yeah, if the world were flat, we'd all be looking at each other.
That's right.
Let me ask you about this campaign. Do you ever want to say to John Kerry, get some heart, get some guts, get some of that sort of passion that I had? I know you got in trouble a little bit for too much passion, but do you think there's a middle ground between you and him?
I think people are going to make a career of underestimating John Kerry. He's a very strong closer.
Yeah.
I know all the Washington yak.
Okay, I'm one of them. Go ahead. You want to start?
Well,
I'm just saying that I'm asking you honestly. Cross your heart. Do you think John Kerry could show more heart?
You could always do this or do that. Let me tell you something that I think the national press has not gotten. I think Kerry had a great week last week. He was in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania talking about jobs. All the press that I read was not very good. But the press in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where it really matters, was terrific. I think the national press always misses it because they never want to write the same story the local press writes, but it's the local press story that really matters. I think Kerry had a great week last week. This campaign is going to have a lot of ups and downs. Kerry's going to make mistakes. Bush is going to make mistakes. We got a long, long way to go here. I think John's in a pretty good place right now, and I think this ad campaign is going to help some.
What are the odds right now? 50-50 for the general?
Oh, it's so close. The polls are very, very close. There's no question there's going to be a very close election.
Okay, we're going to come right back and talk to Governor Howard Dean about what he's up to. Howard Dean, coming back on Hardball.
That we're very concerned about. We could be walking into a replay of last year.
As bad as that was, the wildfire outlook for much of the West and southwestern Alaska is significantly worse than a year ago.
In a year where you have high temperatures and extreme drought, this is setting up a situation where fires are going to create a lot of damage. They're going to burn individual homes and even communities.
California fire officials say that while this fire season may be off to an early, alarming start, at least this year, their firefighters are more prepared to respond than a year ago.
And what Gary was suggesting with regard to his client is these are all factual questions which will be up ultimately to a jury to decide whether his client was involved in a factual way in these transactions or not. The fundamental...
Aggressively, do you expect the Pentagon to prosecute these charges?
Well, Chris, when we talk about prosecution of the charges, I think the investigation is still ongoing. Gary's client and several others have gone through an Article 32, a preliminary investigation which could lead to a court-martial. Others are still under investigation. I think I would agree that these are factual questions to be decided by a jury, but it's a much larger issue that ultimately the American people will have to deal with. And yes, I think it's very important that the Army act very quickly to deal with this matter. One way or the other, whether they're held innocent or guilty, the Army needs to be very aggressive and not let this languish.
Gary, you have been quoted as saying the stupidest thing the Army could have done is to charge these reservists. Very quickly, what are you talking about there?
Well, I think that those who made the decision to charge did not understand the collateral issues with respect to the intelligence community, with respect to the private contractors who were involved with the intelligence community, and did not appreciate the fact that there would be multiple collateral issues of huge political significance.
Is that another way of saying this
case.
has opened up a huge can of worms?
Well, you said it much better than I did.
Would you agree?
I agree completely.
On that note, Gary Myers, thank you very much, and Professor Scott Silliman, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
It was another deadly day in Iraq. That story when we come back.
In recent tests, the Mitsubishi and lack of accountability by the military and perhaps by military intelligence. The misconduct first. The most grotesque details emerging now from an investigative report published first by the New Yorker's Seymour Hersh. According to an Army report that Hersh obtained, detainees were not only photographed naked in sexually explicit poses, but actually sodomized with objects and threatened with rape. Chemical liquids were also apparently part of what can only be described as torture. But today, a much more serious element to the charges of abuse. In this photograph, an Iraqi man is shown wrapped in cellophane with numerous bruises on his face. He was, according to Hersh's report, beaten to death during or after an interrogation. A senior U.S. intelligence official tells NBC News that the agency's inspector general has begun his own investigation of the alleged abuses, while simultaneously claiming there is no evidence of CIA involvement in those abuses. The Senate's Armed Services Committee will convene a closed-door hearing on the allegations tomorrow morning. 6 military officers have been criminally charged and face possible courts-martial. 7 more have been reprimanded, but only one commander's name has surfaced. No one is making the charge that Brigadier General Janis Karpinski is the Henry Wirz of Abu Ghraib prison.